We're here to idea everyone, to fire up your curiosity and connect you with the people and ideas that shape our world. Watch, listen, understand, connect, create. Let's move the human story forward together. The ancient town of St. Gallen in Switzerland has been a centre of learning for centuries. And since 1969, the students of its university have organised an annual symposium, bringing together leaders and thinkers of all ages from all over the world. This year, ideaXme joined them. One of the speakers at this year's event was Kristina Lunz, an entrepreneur, author, activist and founder of the Centre for Feminist Foreign Policy. I'm Neil Koenig, and I began this interview for ideaXme by asking Kristina Lunz to tell us more about feminist foreign policy.
Feminist foreign policy is the attempt and also vision to bring radical feminist thinking and analysis and demands into foreign and security policy. So that means a focus on human security and human rights instead of militarized security, and the demand to prioritize human rights, defending human rights, climate justice, and a spending of annual and international budgets towards what makes our society safe, secure and sustainable for everyone, instead of contributing to the destructiveness that foreign policy has been in the past to a large extent.
Where did this idea come from?
So, feminist foreign policy and feminist activism in foreign and security policy has a long tradition. Actually, it was at least in 1915 that this idea was really translated into practical policy making, when during the First World War in 1915, 1,500 women feminists came together in The Hague for a conference, the Women's Peace Conference, to not only demand an end to the First World War, but additionally they published 20 resolutions on a new global order, and that included, for example, an end to secret diplomacy and democratizing diplomacy. It also included an end of the industrial military complex, so a too close interaction between the military industry and political decision makers. It also included peace mediation as a key tool for conflict resolution, and so forth. It also included the establishment of an organization for conflict resolution and a court for arbitration, and most of the demands of those women and feminists back then, they were not listened to, but over the decades, or most of them, except for disarmament, were actually put into reality.
So this idea actually has quite a long history. I mean, maybe you can go back even further into when women were allowed to vote.
The women's suffrage actually was one of the key demands as well at the conference in The Hague, because in 1915 most countries still did not have women's suffrage. So the movement towards feminist foreign policy emerged from the women's suffrage movement. But yeah, you're right, potentially the origins are even earlier, but well, I'm not that aware, and most people wouldn't be, because our history books are full of the history and stories of men and what men have achieved, and kind of the silencing or the lack of visibility of women's ideas and stories. That is, to change that is one of the key motors of feminist activism as well.
This idea seems to be having a bit of a moment just now. Why is that?
Yeah, indeed. So by now we have 11 countries that officially have a feminist foreign policy, and even more so that are currently developing one or interested in the concept. There's a group at the United Nations called Feminist Foreign Policy Plus Group, around 25-30 countries that are engaging around that topic. Germany, for example, one of the leading industrialized countries, and published and presented their feminist foreign policy strategy on the 1st of March this year. So there's a lot happening. There are more and more civil society organizations, think tanks engaged in feminist foreign policy as well. And there's this, I think because we live in this time where the amount of crises is just so overwhelming. And additionally, statistics show that over the past 10 years, between 2010 and 2020, the number of international conflicts and wars has doubled from roughly 30 to 60. So has the number of people killed in conflicts and wars. So has the number of people, of refugees, from around 40 million to 80 million, and by now it's around 100 million people fleeing. So there's this desire for new solutions, because traditional policy making, not only for foreign policy, but policy making in general, has not contributed to a sustainable, safe, just environment for everyone, where everyone's needs and ideas and lived realities are actually turned into policy making that will then serve everyone. But policy making traditionally has served this very limited group in society that has been in positions of power, and it's just not working. It's destroyed our environment, kind of the very conditions that we're living on, and it has produced an environment where the latest figures last week have shown that more than $2 trillion dollars annually are spent on military budgets worldwide, when at the same time around 6.5 billion are spent by the UN on peacekeeping. That is less than 0.4% of the annual global budgets on military spending. And with kind of these decisions and these priorities, there's no way that we can create a world that is safe, in peace, and secure for everyone.
This notion, it seems to chime with other movements or processes going on at the moment of looking back at the past and questioning existing structures. I'm thinking, for example, of the way that colonialism is being given a fresh look.
Yeah, that is very true. And so for us, so I have a team, my organization, we're a team of 17 people in Berlin, and we're working on feminism and foreign policy in different areas, from climate justice and defending human rights, disarmament, feminist and international assistance policy. And in all these areas, how we approach the work is always from an intersectional perspective. So really trying to understand at the same time not only the different forms of oppression and discrimination different groups of people experience, which lead to a very diverse range of lived experiences, but also making the connections between different dynamics, such as colonialism or neo-colonialism, that is unfair power structures and dependencies between global north and global south countries that still exist. So especially when you talk to feminist grassroots organizations in the global south, for them it's clear, like the feminist movement for them has always been very strongly connected with the decolonial movement. So we are trying to bring in decolonial perspectives into our work as well.
How can you go about implementing something like this when men seem to have still such a firm grip on power in many countries, including many of the largest countries?
It's tough. So how we work is mainly through advocacy. So we've been advocating towards the German government to implement a feminist foreign policy for the past 5 years. Germany just implemented a feminist foreign policy. And we are advising other governments on their strategies on a feminist foreign policy. But we're also producing knowledge, because what you focus on gets bigger. And if foreign ministries around the world are full with their desks are packed with strategies on militarizations and like the procurement of weapons and the economic strategies, but there are no strategies on how to support civil society in autocratic regimes, then there's a problem. So what we're doing is we're implementing projects. We're currently implementing around 11, 12 projects funded by different entities, for example, on producing knowledge or like a guideline on how countries can support feminist civil society in autocratic regimes. We're also producing knowledge working with Ukrainian civil society on what would a feminist approach towards Russia's war in the Ukraine look like. We're working with leading Afghan women human rights defenders to bring their demands on how the international community should deal with the Taliban into foreign policy fora. So this is how we are trying to implement feminist thinking into concrete policy making.
It doesn't necessarily have to be grand strategies. I remember listening to a podcast where you were talking about the issue raised by what sounds like a very good idea, turning off streetlights at night in order to save power. But that can have unforeseen consequences.
Yeah, and those unforeseen consequences are that the lived experiences of men and women and non-binary people, all of us, they're different when we walk home at night, because some of us they're a lot more targeted by male violence than others, and the safety, the feeling for security is so different for different groups of society, which is why feminist foreign policy focuses on human security. Human security is this understanding that everyone should be safe and secure when it comes to like basic needs such as having a roof over the head, education, access to health, and the concept tries to recognize that depending on how we are socialized, depending on factors such as our gender, race, religion, sexuality, we experience society very differently, because society reacts differently to different groups because of those characteristics. And human security tries to take this into account and knows that only because a country spends millions and billions on weaponry and arms, it does by no means mean that the people within this country are safe. It's quite the opposite, for example, for people who are racialized. A securitization of the police, for example, can have very negative implications for men of color. And human security, the concept of human security, challenges the idea that militarized security means security for everyone.
There have been, throughout history, female leaders, female political leaders, and they're not always the most diplomatic of folk, are they? As indeed can be said of many men.
Yeah, there have been female leaders that were great, and then others who were just as destructive as the society by which they were socialized by. And first of all, I think it's important that we recognize that just because someone might be a woman, it doesn't mean that they're feminist. And just because if someone is a man doesn't mean they can't be feminist. And then at the same time, so the current figures are that roughly, I think 10-12% of leaders, like heads of governments, heads of states worldwide, are women. And historically that has been even less at any given point in history. So in those very few instances where we had women as leaders, I think it might be even more kind of standing out if they were like particularly bad leaders. But I think we will only have really reached equity at some point if we allow, for example, for women to be just as bad leaders as for men. Of course, ideally they wouldn't be, because we need great leaders from all genders for the sake of a good and healthy future. But just speaking of equity, women should have the chance to be just as under average as some of the male leaders.
What are the sort of timescales you're thinking about?
So I think feminist foreign policy practitioners and thinkers, they're really good at distinguishing between short, medium and long term, knowing that in the short term sometimes we need reactions or solutions. Well, in the short term it's mainly reactions that try to mitigate violence and the destructiveness that is out there in patriarchal societies. That can include the delivery of weapons, for example, in a concrete situation of war. But in the medium and long term, we need better solutions that start building societies that do not have such a high potential for violence to then turn into real violence. So speaking of a timeline when it comes to like transforming foreign and security policy making, well, I hope that in the short term, maybe the next 1 to 5 years, we will see 2 handful of other countries adopting a feminist foreign policy. And in the medium to long term, so speaking of decades and maybe even centuries, that we as society, we start to recognize that there cannot be foreign policy making without putting human rights at the very center. And we, you know, if we look at concrete examples, for example, Iran and Germany's response towards Iran, the support by our current foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, with regards to the women protesters and all protesters on the street, that is unprecedented. And in the past, there were protests in Iran as well. But heads of state in Germany preferred congratulating the leaders of Iran on kind of the on the anniversary of the Islamic Revolution in '79, instead of questioning how women are treated in the country. So and individuals and Nobel laureates such as Shirin Ebadi would say that it has been because of economic interests, because they overshadowed the urge to challenge regimes for their treatment of women's rights and human rights. And a feminist foreign policy in the medium to long term, there can be no question that human rights always have to be at the core, and that economic interests would never be allowed to take precedence over human rights.
Can you think of any examples where this kind of thing has worked, in a sense that, say, a developed country has taken a stand on some issue and there's been a positive response, that something has changed in another country?
So, you know, for example, when Donald Trump, when he became president, he enacted the global gag rule again, the Mexico City rule, meaning that there was no US-American funding to any NGOs, organizations that work on abortion, sexual reproductive health and rights, including abortion. So there are so many organizations around the world all of a sudden lacked millions of funds and necessary funds to provide health care and health support to girls and women around the world. And what we saw then is countries, I think at the forefront were the Netherlands, who stepped in and set up a big fund to compensate for that lack of money, for example. That would be a beautiful example.
So this works then?
It can work if political leaders, if governments that are formed by political leaders dare to question old conventions and dare to go new paths. Yeah.
So what do you see as the biggest challenges you face at the moment?
The biggest challenges are always conventions and the forces that try to keep the status quo. So too many people have an interest in keeping the status quo. So this is one problem, and then even more so, for a couple of years, for the past 5 to 10 years, we have seen an ever increasing anti-feminist movement, which is very closely linked to the autocratic movement. And it's a movement that is well organized, extremely well funded. Between 2009 and 2018, more than 700 million US dollars were invested into Europe, mainly from the US and Russia, to eradicate especially women's and LGBTQI rights, kind of to attack the human rights system by supporting countries to challenge the Istanbul Convention, an important convention against male violence against women, by challenging same-sex marriage and so forth. So this anti-feminist, anti-democratic, autocratic international movement, it's getting stronger and stronger. We are seeing the percentage of democracies around the world is at one of its lowest since, of course, we had the peak in the development to more and more democratic countries, but since then there has been this decline, and authors such as Gideon Rahman in his book on the Age of the Strongman, he argues that we're seeing the most severe attack on liberal democratic rights since the 1930s. So this is one of the biggest challenges.
Who are your allies? Can the business world help you? Because they've been grappling with the issue of diversity for some time now.
Well, they have the money, so of course they can help us. You know, in our society, one of the big problems is that profits are being privatized, and externalities and costs are being put on communities as a whole. And then you have activists, human rights defenders, climate defenders, non-profit organizations that come in and try to clean up the mess. Those costs and externalities that are very often caused by those who at the same time have the privilege of privatizing the profits. And that is such a huge injustice. So it is the private sectors, it's the companies that are in a position to privatize profits in a way that is completely out of proportion and unfair and unjust. So I would expect that companies, that the corporate world invests heavily into fighting the climate crisis, supporting human rights defenders, and those who are cleaning up the mess.
Do you get any help from female business leaders?
We do, here and there, especially a couple of really cool Berlin-based female-founded startups, but there's lots of scope for improvement.
What would be your advice to younger people who are thinking of working in the area that you work in now? Question
conventions all the time. The very ideas for success, for how our society should work, for how power is being distributed, that it's outdated and it will never lead to a fair society. So please question conventions around, you know, when there's this like game or little game when, you know, when we all close our eyes and we have to imagine, okay, so everything is back to square zero, and you wake up tomorrow and you have no control over where in the world you would be reborn. What would you prefer, that we have a world with like equal opportunities everywhere, or would we keep the world where we have most opportunities and most wealth in a couple of countries, and huge parts of the world would not enjoy many basic human rights? Of course, most of us would say, oh, please, let's have like equally distributed and fair world if I have no control over where I would be reborn. So for younger people, please question and conventions around why you deserve to have a certain career path, why the world is built this way, why it is certain companies that should be able to make so much profit, and why it is that human rights defenders in many countries in the world live under so much like personal risk and in unsafe conditions, and question how opportunities are distributed, and question who's making decisions for whom and whose stories and lived experiences are not included in the in decision-making processes. Yeah, question conventions.
Kristina Lunz, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being with us for this episode of the ideaXme Show. ideaXme is a global platform. Our mission is to move the human story forward by sharing knowledge of the future. You can find us on all major audio networks at www.radioideaXme.com, on YouTube and Vimeo. Please subscribe.